Hi, I'm the history guy. I know people ask about behind the scenes of the history guy all the time, and one of the things you might not know about behind the scenes is that it's always been a partnership between myself and my lovely wife, who's written several of the episodes of the history guy. And so today, for the first time, she's going to come in front of the camera to talk about a little known historical figure that has inspired her. You know, it's a scene that would be familiar with anybody who reads mystery novels. A young woman goes missing in a vast Victorian city. The police are unable to help, and finally, in frustration, her father hires a detective who, using deductive reasoning and unconventional methods, solves the case that the police couldn't solve. I mean, it sounds like a novel. It sounds like Sherlock Holmes.
And in a way, it was. In the 1900s in New York City, there was someone that newspaper reporters actually called Mrs. Sherlock Holmes. She was otherwise known as Mary Grace Quackenbos Humiston, and she was such an extraordinary investigator that she was the first female to be hired to work with the New York City Police Department as a consulting detective. She's history that deserves to be remembered. Mary Grace Winterton was born in September of 1869 in New York. Mary Grace's father, Adoniram Judson Winterton, worked as an insurance claims adjuster and often took his daughter when he testified in court. Mary Grace said her childhood memories of this time with her father led her to her later interest in the law. After both her parents died within a year of each other, Grace began wearing all black clothes, which would become her signature look for the rest of her life. Mary Grace married Henry Forrest Quackenbos, a doctor, in 1895, but they divorced within a few years. She would marry a lawyer, Howard Donnell Humiston, in 1911, but between those relationships, Mary Grace did what few women of her time managed. She graduated from law school at New York University. In the United States at that time, historians estimate that there were about 1,000 female lawyers in the entire country. Most entered the profession to help their families manage estates, but Mary Grace became a lawyer with a different purpose in mind. She wanted to help those without resources to afford more traditional lawyers. Shortly after she passed the bar exam, Mary Grace received a letter asking for her help. Antoinette Tola was on death row for the murder of Joseph Santa. She had pled self-defense in court, but had lost, partially because the translation of her testimony was unclear and also because, though she claimed Santa had a gun and she had killed him in self-defense, no one could locate such a gun. Mary Grace, who was opposed to the death penalty on principle, approached New Jersey Governor Edward C. Stokes for a pardon or commutation of the sentence, but he declined, saying, "The woman is guilty, and I can't do anything about the sentence. The law must take its course." However, he gave Mary Grace the appeal record for the trial, wishing her luck in finding any overlooked detail to prove Tola's version of events. Mary Grace frantically read the record and found it written, "No pistol seems to have been found other than the one used by the defendant." She questioned the wording "seems" and approached the county coroner asking to see Santa's gun on the assumption that it existed because of Tola's testimony. To her surprise, it was produced, along with the rest of the contents of the dead man's pockets, proving Tola's original claim in court, that she was acting in self-defense. Mary Grace brought the new evidence back to Governor Stokes and the Board of Appeals. The vote came back 6-2 and commuted Tola's sentence from the death penalty to less than 8 years in prison. This was an extraordinary achievement, as the death penalty had rarely, if ever, been commuted in New Jersey. It was one of Mary Grace's first successes, and her career took off from there. She worked for a time at the Legal Aid Society of New York City and left to create her own business, the People's Law Firm. Mary Grace hung a sign outside that read, "Justice for those of limited means for moderate fees." She made it a point to hire translators and gave out business cards written in different languages. Mary Grace was also looking for other women to help her in the firm. According to author Brad Ricca, who wrote a biography about Mary Grace entitled Mrs. Sherlock Holmes, she said, "I will train any woman who comes to me. There is always work for women lawyers who are womanly and do not allow their brain to dominate their heart." A good portion of her work consisted in helping families with marriage laws or child support. She also helped protect the underserved, like new immigrants, from being preyed upon by unscrupulous businessmen or practices as they began their new lives in America. She was quoted in a New York newspaper as saying, The newly made Americans are almost at the mercy of any older, cleverer citizen who wants to grind down the hell of oppression upon their necks. Things are also strange to them, and the law is so curiously complicated that they wake suddenly to find themselves tangled hopelessly in muddles that seem often to choke them and blind them. It is to fight the battles of these poor and ignorant without taking all their profits that the People's Law Firm was started, to fight as eagerly for $5 as for 500. One day, Benny Walensky came to the People's Law Firm seeking Mary Grace's help. His back was covered in welts and he was suffering from a fever. Walensky had answered an ad in a New York newspaper for a high-paying laborer's job in Florida and had entered a living nightmare. Yes, the wages were high, but he was expected to pay for everything, from lodging to food and a glass of water. Walensky claimed he was unable to leave the worksite by men who had revolvers until his wife wired him money so he could pay his debt and make his way back to New York. Mary Grace was appalled and went to Florida, Arkansas, and Mississippi, collecting more than 40 affidavits from laborers who went through similar experiences with their employers, who were engaging in a criminal practice known as peonage. Peonage, a system used in southern states after slavery was outlawed, has been called slavery by another name. Essentially, laborers worked to pay off debt to the companies who hired them. Most weren't held captive through force, but if they tried to leave, men from the companies would take everything they owned, leaving them with little choice but to return and continue to work. Sometimes, Mary Grace traveled in disguise to protect herself from the companies she was investigating. She dressed up as a man, an old woman, or used her maiden name to conceal her identity. When Mary Grace presented the results of her 7-week investigation to the Attorney General William Henry Moody, he immediately agreed to send prosecutors down south to try the cases. The government was so impressed that Mary Grace was named Special Assistant U.S. District Attorney for the Southern District of New York, the first woman in U.S. history to receive that appointment. She continued her work into eliminating peonage, with one of her most famous cases being Sunnyside Plantation, where many Italian immigrant workers were kept in debt and starving. Something is radically wrong at Sunnyside, Mary Grace wrote in a letter to the new Attorney General for the United States, Charles Bonaparte. Though her investigations were initially suppressed, they were eventually released to the public, and they helped bring public attention to how immigrants were being taken advantage of in some areas of the country. Mary Grace told reporters, "The point is that we Americans are exploiting the aliens, for while our federal laws are excellent for keeping them out of the country, we show a noticeable lack of interest in them after they are admitted." And some claim we weren't doing a good job protecting our own citizens. In February 1917, Ruth Kruger, a teenager from a wealthy family in New York City, went to run errands and get her ice skates sharpened. She never returned home. When Ruth's family contacted local authorities, the police initially blamed Ruth's disappearance on the girl herself. They asked if she had been known to stay out late and not contact her family, or if perhaps she had secretly eloped. The New York Evening World ran Ruth's photo front page in its evening edition on Valentine's Day. As the press began to spread the word of the missing girl, the police department stepped up its efforts to locate her, but to no avail. Henry Kruger, Ruth's father, grew impatient with the police and hired Mary Grace to find his missing child. Mary Grace soon focused her investigation on a shop owner by the name of Alfredo Cocci. He had been questioned by police about Ruth because she had probably come to his shop to get her skates sharpened. Cocci had denied seeing her, but then disappeared himself a few days later. Cocci's wife Maria continued to run the shop in his absence. The police searched the shop but found nothing. Mary Grace was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. She planted an undercover agent in the shop, but when Maria discovered the deception, she threw the man out and refused to cooperate with police any longer. Meanwhile, Alfredo Cocci himself had turned up back in Italy. He said he left the U.S. because he and his wife fought all the time and he wanted to get away. Mary Grace tried to get Cocci extradited back to the U.S., but Europe was embroiled in the First World War, and the relationship between the U.S. and the Italian government wasn't strong. After interviewing multiple witnesses, young women, who accused Cocci of molesting them or attacking them in a basement space beneath his shop, Mary Grace renewed her efforts to examine it. When Maria, Cocci's wife, sold off the shop because of income difficulties, Mary Grace purchased it and sent in agents from her firm and a building inspector to search the shop from top to bottom. In the basement space in the corner, there was a large workbench that the building inspector moved. Underneath it, they discovered a gaping hole in the floor, and within the hole, they found the remains of Ruth Kruger. She had been stabbed and tied up so her body was nearly bent in half. A coroner's jury quickly determined it was murder. Kochi was never extradited back to the U.S., but after years of delays he was eventually convicted of the murder of Ruth Kruger and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Italy did not have the death penalty like New York at that time. The press excoriated the NYPD because of Mary Grace's success at locating Ruth Kruger when they failed. Her reputation was at its height when she was called Mrs. Sherlock Holmes by reporters. She had also found another focus for her life's work, missing persons cases. Mary Grace said, "In 1 year, 828 persons disappeared from the streets. In 3 of the 5 boroughs, there were 244 murders. These conditions indicate either that the New York is the most criminal city in the world or the police force is inefficient." She created foundations to protect women and children and was hired on as a consultant, an unpaid position, to the NYPD. After a series of public statements accusing a military base of preying upon young women and concealing their murders, public opinion turned against Mary Grace. She assured the press that she had evidence to support her statements, but it was never made public, and her assertions only served to cement her reputation as a hysteric and, according to her enemies, an emotionalist. History is forgotten for a variety of reasons. Sometimes because of war or politics, the hero or heroine of the moment is forgotten. And Mary Grace died in 1948 out of the limelight. Reportedly, some from her own family called her Aunt Disgrace. It's unclear why she made claims of large-scale wrongdoing on a military base, but maybe she had just become so accustomed to looking for evil that she saw it where maybe it didn't lie. But she leaves an amazing legacy of passionate advocacy. She helped change police attitudes about how they search for missing persons. She was known to lament that sometimes they didn't even go looking for these girls because they assumed they were bad to begin with. But Mary Grace Quackenbos Humanston helped change these attitudes, and because of her work, Missing Persons Bureau was established by the New York City Police Department. After she solved the Ruth Kruger case, she received letters from thousands of people across the country asking for her help to find missing loved ones, and that stuck with her the rest of her life. In an interview in 1920, she was quoted as saying, "Let me tell you a little bit about these girls. Each and every one of them has a particular place in my heart."
I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.